Hello, my name is Samira Salem and I'm the Director of Community Development Services at Forward Community Investments. I'd like to thank you for joining today's webinar presentation, the National Equity Atlas, Data to Advance Equitable Growth Locally. This webinar represents the launch of the second season of FCR's webinar series on racial equity. At FCI, our mission is to be an investor, connector, and advisor for organizations and initiatives that reduce socioeconomic and racial disparities in Wisconsin. FCI has partnered with BMO Harris Bank to bring you this series. We want to thank BMO Harris Bank for their generous support. Over the next few months, we'll be offering monthly webinars exploring challenging topics at the intersection of community development and racial equity. Today, we're thrilled that Sarah Truhaft, the Director of Equitable Growth Initiatives at PolicyLink, and Angel Ross, a Research Associate at PolicyLink, will be talking about their work on equity and economic growth. What they find is that equity is the superior growth model. So equity doesn't just benefit people of color, it benefits everyone, and inequity hurts everyone. Sarah and Angel will also be walking us through the National Equity Atlas, a powerful and user-friendly data resource that they've developed with their partners at USC's Program for Environmental and Regional Equity, or PEER. This tool helps to track and make the case for inclusive growth. Finally, they'll be sharing strategies for how to get more equitable growth locally. We wanted to kick off this year's series on racial equity with a presentation that reminds us that we have a shared destiny, the stakes are high, and that there are ways that we can advance equitable economic growth. We see this webinar as a touchstone for the webinars to follow. Before we turn it over to Sarah and Angel, I'd like to take a moment to share a couple of housekeeping items. There will be opportunities for Q&A, so if you have questions and comments during the discussion, please submit them using the chat or question box on the right-hand side of your screen. As always, we'll be recording today's presentation and we'll make links available to registrants within a few days. Now I'd like to turn the webinar over to Sarah and Angel. Welcome to you both.
Thank you so much, Samira, and Angel is turning the camera on. Hi again, I'm Sarah Truhaft, Director of Equitable Growth Initiatives at PolicyLink, and next to me is
Angel Ross, and I'm a Research Associate here at PolicyLink.
And we just want to thank Forward Community Investments for inviting us to share with you our work on equitable growth. We are going to be sharing with you first. I'm going to turn it to a PowerPoint to share with you our messaging framework around equitable growth and equity as the superior growth model. Then we'll have time for a few minutes of Q&A, and then Angel will then take you through a live demo of the National Equity Atlas tool. But for those of you who are new to PolicyLink, we are a national research and action institute based in Oakland, California, but with offices in New York and DC and LA, small offices there. And our mission is advancing economic and social equity. And our tagline is lifting up what works. We have roots in the community building movement, and we look to find what is working on the ground and scale it up through policy solutions. And we work in partnership with local communities across the country. So I'm going to turn it over to the PowerPoint slide. Angel is going to turn it to the PowerPoint slide, and we'll see you in a few minutes after we're done. So in 2011, PolicyLink was founded in 1999. Previous slide. And, oh, it looks like, sorry. So PolicyLink was founded in 1999, and we have been equipping advocates with relevant framing and messaging to push forward their strategies around racial and economic inclusion. And as the census was coming out with its new data in 2010 around demographic change, we realized that it was really the case now that racial and economic inclusion was not just a moral imperative, but also an economic imperative. And so we partnered with our research institute at the University of Southern California called the Program for Environmental and Regional Equity. It's headed up by Manuel Pastor, whose research you may know about. we partnered with them to develop a messaging framework around that claim that equity is a superior growth model. And it starts with looking at demographic change. So the face of America is changing. Next slide. We know that communities of color, Black Americans, Latinos, Asians, people of mixed and other racial backgrounds are driving growth and change in this nation, and this image shows you that shift from 1980 through the projections in 2050. Now the U.S. Census projects that we will be a majority people of color nation by 2044, and you see that in this chart where by 2050, 47% of the population will be non-Hispanic white. And as you see, the growth in the blue line, that is the Latino population, but you see growth across communities of color. Next slide. And then we can see this graphically. So we have a series of maps that I'm going to show you now, taking you through demographic change. So stay there for a minute. So if you go back to, this was our country in 1980, and the red counties are majority people of color. So you see a few in the south, of course, and then along the border. By the next slide, 2040, this is what our nation will look like when we are majority people of color. So lots more red, lots more orange, growing communities of color. Right now, the majority of youth under age 5 are youth of color. And the majority of youth 18 and under will be of color by 2020. So this shift is happening rapidly, and it's this picture, if you go to the next slide, it is really happening all over, including in Wisconsin, as I'm sure you have experienced, where it is growing communities of color that are contributing to population growth in communities, and the white population, because of the aging baby boomers, is declining. So even in places that don't have large shares of communities of color, they're still predominantly white, they are still seeing these large increases, and growth is coming from those diverse communities. So demographic change is really the first part of our framing and looking at that in different places. And then the second part is around the threat of inequity and inequality. So if you can go to the next slide. Traditionally in economics, there was the theory that inequality was actually an incentive to growth. That theory is increasingly being disproven. It takes a long time to disprove theories, and there's debate in the field. But here you see a picture of an economist showing that it's Larry Summers, and his quote that he really worries that inequities pose a serious threat to growth, and that the failure of our nation to include communities of color would mean a failure of the American economy. So that quote is from our book that we produced with the Center for American Progress called All in Nation. And there we really share more of this evidence. But studies from the OECD, from the IMF, the research from Raj Chetty and his colleagues, the research from Manuel Pastor, who heads up our partnership organization, PEER, and Chris Benner, looking at how regions actually are stronger economically when they have less inequity, disparity, segregation. And Raj Chetty's work shows that there's more economic mobility when there's less inequality and segregation. So the research is really underscoring this point that inclusion is the right way forward. Next slide, please. One important piece of that is looking at the health of our workforce and the ability of our workforce to power the economy of the future. And so this slide is looking at the share of on the left-hand side, the share of jobs that will require an associate's degree or higher soon in 2020. This is data from the Georgetown Center for Education and the Workforce. So they project that 47% of jobs will require that level of education. As you know, jobs are upskilling, so they are requiring more skills. And then to the right, you see the share of the population that have the working age population that has that level of education. So you see for that a lot of our fastest growing groups do not have that level of education. So Latino immigrants, 15% have an AA or above. Among the African American and Black population, 28%. This is nationally. And so you see that we really need to increase the skills and education of the workforce to meet the needs of jobs in the future. And I don't know, your region has come out with studies, but for example, I was in Pittsburgh just last week, and they've projected that there will be a shortfall of 80,000 workers in their region because of retiring baby boomers and the lack of skills in the current workforce. So they really need to invest in their homegrown talent. So this is very common across the country. And then the next part of our framing is around the benefits of equity, that equity really is the superior growth model. Next slide. And we've done some calculations to really show how that is true. And one calculation that we've done is looking at how much stronger would the economy be if there were not racial gaps in income. And so we did this calculation looking at those gaps in income in terms of both hours worked and employment. And for the nation, it is 2.1 trillion. And then we looked at it for all 150 regions in the nation. And that is what you see in this map here, how much higher gross domestic product, the aggregate economic output in a region, would be if there were not those racial gaps in income. And this is data you'll find on the Equity Atlas. Angel will share it with you, but this is not available anywhere else. And so it's very powerful for advocates to be able to say, hey, our economy would be a lot stronger if we had more inclusion. And so how do we get there? Of course, our mission is around making change happen, not just studying the phenomenon. And so we put out strategies, policies at the federal, regional, state, and local level. The next slide shares strategies that we've shared at the regional level, really, around inclusive growth. And these 6 points talk about first growing good jobs, really supporting your economic development policies, supporting industries and businesses that are creating those middle wage good jobs that provide benefits, provide living wages. Those are the types of jobs we want to see growing. But we also know that many of the sectors that are driving growth and change are actually producing a lot of low wage jobs. So to improve inclusion, we need to raise the floor on low wage work. Home health care workers is one of the fastest growing occupations, and those tend to be low paying jobs, but there are models and strategies for improving those through training, through cooperatives. Connecting workers to jobs and careers. This is about job access and ensuring that people who need work, who are underemployed, can connect to those jobs through strategies like local hiring, targeted hiring. Strengthening the pre-K to career pipeline. This is your education and workforce systems. Dismantling barriers to employment, such as the box that asks you if you have a criminal record and other forms of discrimination against people who have barriers to employment, such as incarceration, being formerly incarcerated. And then reconnecting neighborhoods to the regional and global economy. So we recognize that place-based strategies are really important too. So this is one set of regional strategies that we put out and share examples of inclusive growth. And just to mention, we have a newsletter. There's not a slide in here. We have a newsletter called America's Tomorrow that highlights those strategies. It comes out every couple of weeks that you can sign up for. So we also work hand in hand with local partners. So that's the national framing around demographic change, the threat of inequity, the benefits of equity. And that story differs from region to region. If you're Fresno, that's a different story than you're Bay Area, or if you're Madison. And so that tailoring that story requires working with partners in regions. And so we've done that. We've produced equity profiles that are analyzing the state of equity at the regional level in these 12 regions here, and we've worked with these collaboratives to help them create a narrative around how equity matters to their economic futures. Next slide, please. We start out that with a definition of what an equitable region is, and it's about being able to fully participate in the region's economic vitality, contribute to the readiness for the future, and connecting to assets and resources, regardless of race, ethnicity, nativity, gender, neighborhood. It goes on, that list, but that's really our definition that we put out there. And then we have a framework for looking at indicators in the region, which Angel will show you in the demo. So I'm not going to go into detail here, but it's looking at the demographic change and then looking at these 3 facets of equity. Next slide. The Atlas is built upon a regional equity indicators database, and the profiles that we just shared with you are also built upon that database. It provides consistent geography regions going back to 1979 for a lot of economic indicators, and then projecting forward. The next slide. And then to share with you, and I just have one more slide after this, and then we can go to Q&A, how is this having an impact? Which is a critical question. So one example of impact, a recent example, is from Fairfax County, where we developed this equity profile in partnership with many groups in the county. Fairfax County is one of the wealthiest counties in the nation, and yet there are many inequities. And so the profile helped to lead to this adoption by the county, and soon, if not just recently, by the school board, of a One Fairfax resolution that prioritizes racial equity, and they are now going to integrate it throughout their governance using a racial equity tool. They are a part of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, which I know Madison is also a part of. So they are a part of a network of communities that are integrating equity throughout their policies and decision making. And then the next example is in Portland, where the Portland Development Commission has now put out a 5-year strategic plan. We supported them in developing this. That strategic plan, the Portland Development Commission, is their economic development and redevelopment agency, and this plan prioritizes racial equity. It acknowledges the harm that that redevelopment agency has done in communities of color, and it puts forth specific goals that are around racial equity and inclusion. It also makes the business case, including data that we've shared. And they've put forth several programs around inclusive entrepreneurship that are really reaching out to the diverse communities that are driving growth in Portland. And as an example of their success, they have a startup initiative where they've been investing in startups. It's called PDX Startup. And that now, for the past 2 years, 60% of the startup founders are Black or Latino. So they have really been making some measurable progress on this. So those are just a couple of examples of how we are driving change on the ground through this messaging framework and through the data that we've provided and the hands-on support that we've provided to communities. And so I am going to stop there. We're going to go back to the camera, and I believe that Samira has been queuing up some questions from you for the Q&A after. Yeah.
So thanks so much, Sarah. I'd like to invite folks that have questions to go ahead and submit them through the chat function. We will forward those on to Sarah and Angel, and yes, so this is the moment.
And then just to let you know what will come next, Angel will then go to the National Equity Atlas and do a live demo. And we can go there if you don't have questions.
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and move on there, and then we can try and pick up any questions at the end.
Okay, great. So turn it over to Angel.
All right, thank you, Sarah. I'm going to pull up the National Equity Atlas. And okay, so here we are at the home page. Sarah provided a really great overview of the framework and the partnership that created the Equity Atlas between PolicyLink and PEER. And now I'm just going to go through a live walkthrough of the Atlas and some of the different capabilities of the Atlas. So here we are at the home page, and you'll notice that the website is organized around the same narrative that Sarah just went through about how changing demographics make equity an ever more urgent imperative. So the first part of that story that you'll recognize from the slides, which is that the face of America is changing, that inequity threatens economic prosperity, and lastly the solution, which is that equity is the superior growth model. So under each of these headings is some explanatory narrative and an indicator to support the framing. So for example, under this one, this map shows the projected share of people of color in 2040 by county. And this indicator really paints a picture of how demographic change is happening across the nation. And by 2044, as Sarah mentioned, the country will become majority people of color. So if we go to the top navigation, you can look at the site through data summaries and indicators. I'm going to go ahead and start with the data summaries because it's a really good place to really explore the Atlas, and this section could also be subtitled Your City, State, or Region's Equity Story in 6 Parts. So I'm going to go ahead, and the default one is for the United States as a whole, but I'm going to go ahead and put in Wisconsin. And the data summary, again, follows that same 3-part narrative from the home page. So the first part is that the face of America is changing. So here we see that chart that Sarah showed for the whole United States. Here we see it just for the state of Wisconsin. So in 1980, Wisconsin was almost 94% white. And by 2044, it's projected to be less than 72% white. And again, we see a lot of that. It has to do with growth in communities of color. And if we see the percent change in the population between 2000 and 2010, Latinos are really driving growth in the state. Moving on to the second part, which is that inequity threatens economic prosperity. You can see the earned income growth for full-time wage and salary workers in the state. And actually, the bottom 80% of full-time workers have experienced decreases in their income from 1980 to 2012. While the top 10% have actually seen an increase, and the only ones that have seen an increase. We can also look at the median hourly wage for people of color and for whites, and since over the last decade, it's actually the wages have gone down for both groups, but the gap has grown. And lastly, the equity is the superior growth model. So Sarah mentioned that we do an analysis here where we estimate what the GDP could be in a region or a state with racial equity and income. And so here's what the projected one would be in 2012 with racial equity, and we see that the economy would have been more than $14 billion larger in the state of Wisconsin if there had been no racial gaps in income. So these summaries are available for every geography in the database. We have all 50 states, the largest 150 regions, the largest 100 cities, and we also include national data to have a reference point to understand how your community compares to the nation as a whole. And this data summary is a really great tool to start the conversation about demographic change and equity, but I'm going to get into the meat of the Atlas, which are our indicators. So if we go to the top and select indicators, this is where users can explore all the indicators that we currently have available on the Atlas, which are organized under 3 sections. The first one is demographics, so this shows how the demographics are changing in your community. The second bucket is equity, and within equity we look at economic vitality, we look at readiness of the population to participate in the economy, and we look at connectedness, how well are residents able to connect to broader economic opportunities. And lastly, we have economic benefits. So we have 34 indicators on the Atlas. We continue to add them every month or so. We're going to be adding a couple more health equity indicators before the end of the year. And we won't have time to discuss all of them, obviously, but I did want to walk you through a few. And I'm going to start with one of our demographics indicators, and that is the racial generation gap. Again, this is going to be, since I typed in Wisconsin, it's going to stay Wisconsin. And if you have a question about what does this indicator mean, what is the racial generation gap, if you hover over this question mark on any of the indicator pages, it'll give you the definition. So you can see the percentage of youth, people under 18, and seniors, people 65 and older, who are people of color. And again, people of color refer to all people who do not identify as non-Hispanic white. And the racial generation gap is the difference in the percent of youth and seniors of color. Here you can also see a link to the data and methods document. So if you have questions about where some of the methods that we use or data sources, and you can click on that link and that'll take you to our data and methods document. So here we are. And in addition to the state of Wisconsin, the Atlas also has data for the cities of Madison and Milwaukee, as well as the Madison and Milwaukee metro areas. Parts of Wisconsin are also included in the Chicago and Minneapolis metro areas. And when we release our new mapping function next week, you'll also be able to see county and neighborhood level data for the state. So for this one, I'm going to take us to the city of Madison. And all of the indicator pages have the same basic structure. The first thing that you'll notice is the main graphic display that we see here. Again, if you have a question, hover over the question mark button to tell you about what the indicator is measuring. Below the graphic, we offer framing and examples that advocates or policymakers might need to be able to share this data. And below you have, on the left, is a framing question which helps you to understand what you're looking for. So the framing question says, how large is the racial generation gap? And below the question, there's some language describing the key data points that pull from the graphic display above. So you can see here in Madison, in the city of Madison in 1980, the racial generation gap was just 8 percentage points. But by 2010, that had grown to 37 percentage points. And then on the right, we have a statement about why this indicator matters. Youth are at the forefront of America's demographic transition, and the youth population is much more diverse than the senior population, as we can see here in Madison. And bridging the racial generation gap between a diverse youth population and predominantly white senior population is critical to building a really strong workforce that's ready for the jobs of the future. Moving down below, we include specific strategies that these all change based on the indicator. So these are policies to bridge a racial generation gap. And below those strategies is an example box of a strategy in action. So this particular one talks about caring across generations, which is a national campaign to increase access to in-home care for Medicaid recipients and to improve job quality among those home health care workers that Sarah had mentioned earlier. Underneath at the very bottom are some additional resources and links to other data sites because we want to connect users to actual policies that can be implemented, not just give a bunch of data. So going back to our graphic display, we see that 44% of youth are of color compared with just 7% of seniors. And the racial generation gap has more than tripled over the last 3 decades in Madison. You can also download this graphic. We just improved our downloads. So you can click here and it'll send a JPEG to your downloads, and you can share it on social media on the right over here. The next 2 indicators that I wanted to go through are our equity indicators. And the first one is under our economic vitality subsection, and that's median wages. So we actually have 2 different wage indicators. We have the percent of workers making $15 an hour and median wages. And I'm going to go to median wages just to showcase an indicator that has many different breakdowns and ways to look at the data. And for this one, I'm also going to go to a little bit larger geographic area and look at the whole region, Madison, Wisconsin metro area. So the first graph that we'll see shows the trend over time and how the median hourly wage for workers of color has been considerably lower than that of their white counterparts, and in many places, including the Madison region, the gap has grown. So since 1990, wages have increased for white workers while they've decreased for workers of color. And in 1990, there was a $3 difference in the median wage of whites and people of color, and by 2012, that had doubled to $6. So you'll notice here that there's no data in 1980 for people of color, and that's because people of color accounted for less than 4% of the total population of the region in 1980, And this indicator is only looking at full-time workers ages 25 to 64. So that really narrows down the universe a lot more. And there just weren't enough survey respondents for us to report the median wages for people of color. So if you notice that data is missing, it most likely means that there's just not enough survey responses, because we draw a lot of our data from the census and from the ACS. And so if there's not enough survey responses, we won't report data. The second breakdown that we see underneath the graphic display is by year. And this shows the data by major race and ethnic groups. So you'll notice that a second filter appears, the years filter, that allows you to look at different years. But in 2012, the median wage for API workers, Asian and Pacific Islander workers, was $26 an hour. There's only $14 an hour for Latino workers and $23 an hour for white workers. You can also type in another geography to compare. So if I wanted to type in here and look at how do wages compare to the state in Madison, the state will come up in pink, and then the Madison, Wisconsin region is gray. You can see that wages are higher in the Madison region for nearly all racial and ethnic groups except for Latinos, where the median wage is the same. And if you remember from before, Latinos are the fastest growing demographic group in the state. So another cut of this data allows you to look at how this varies by education. And this can be really powerful because some folks might argue that median wages are lower for certain groups because of lower educational levels. But you'll be able to see within certain educational levels how does the median wage vary. And again, because we're going to be cutting the data a little bit more on the next few breakdowns, I'm going to look at the broader state so that we have more data to look at. So if I click by education, it takes a minute. Right, so here we have median wages by education for the state of Wisconsin. Uh-oh. There we go. And so if we're looking only at the population with a high school diploma, we can see that Native Americans are earning $5 an hour less than their white counterparts. And Latinos with some college or an AA degree have the same median wages as whites with less than a high school diploma. We also have a breakdown by gender, which shows us for every major race and ethnic group, how do median wages vary for women and men. And we see that women have a lower median wage than their male counterparts across all racial and ethnic groups, but it's the smallest within the Latino and the Black population, which are two populations that also have the lowest median wages. So the last two breakdowns of this indicator we just released in the last few months, and they look at by nativity and by ancestry. So 8 indicators, including both of our wage indicators, now further detail the Asian and Pacific Islander, Latino, the Black, white, and Native populations by both nativity and ancestry. So if I look at by nativity, I can see the data for immigrants and for U.S.-born people. And I can take away a few pieces. First, we see that Latino immigrants have the lowest by far, which impacts the median wage for all Latinos in the state. And the median wage for U.S.-born Latinos is actually the same as the median wage for U.S.-born African Americans. And lastly, our ancestry breakdown looks at the data by more detailed race and ethnic subgroups. So if I click on by ancestry, see underneath the graphic display, I have another filter that appears, which is the race and ethnicity filter. So I can look at ancestry groups within the API, Black, Latino, Native American, and white population. So the first one is the Asian or Pacific Islander population. At the very top is the darkest color. This is the overall average for all API people. Slightly lighter are the geographic categories that we created that include the specific subgroups that are underneath it, which are the lightest colors, as well as any additional subgroups that might not meet our reporting threshold. So you can see South Asian, and then underneath South Asian are Indian and any other subgroups that don't have enough survey responses for us to report. So the overall average is $19 an hour for Asian and Pacific Islanders, but we see that among Hmong workers, the median wage is only $15 an hour compared with $36 an hour for Asian Indian workers in Wisconsin. So there's considerable amount of variation even within the API population, and the median wage of Hmong workers actually falls more between the Latino and Black median wages. So we're really excited about this newly released ancestry and nativity data, and we hope that it will be helpful for organizations that are working with more specific populations that can be harder to get data for. So next, under our readiness, we have disconnected youth. And for this one, I want to go look at the other city that's available in the atlas for Wisconsin, and that's Milwaukee. If you have questions about what does this indicator mean, again, hover over the question mark, and disconnected youth are defined as people ages 16 to 24 years old who are not working or enrolled in school. So first we see the total number of disconnected youth over time and the share that are youth of color and white. And the number of disconnected youth in Milwaukee has declined slightly since 2000, but not below 1990 levels. So when searching by race and ethnicity, I can see how the rate of disconnected youth varies across major race and ethnic groups. And Black youth in Milwaukee are more than 3.5 times as likely as white youth to be disconnected. This indicator also has a ranking breakdown, which shows you how does Milwaukee compare to the other largest 100 cities. So overall, the city ranks 24th. You can see the Milwaukee's here in pink, and the cities are ordered from the highest rates of disconnection in Detroit down to the lowest rates. And Madison actually has the lowest rate of disconnected youth among the largest 100 cities. Down below, there's a race and ethnicity filter, so you can see that this is for all youth, but I can also look at it for white youth. And we see that when I do look at it for white youth, the Milwaukee ranking drops all the way down to 77th, indicating that the overall ranking is driven largely by youth of color. And again, Madison has the lowest rate of disconnected white youth. And I can also look at it among youth of color. And when I click on people of color, Milwaukee jumps back up to number 15. So in Milwaukee, young people who are not working or in school are largely young people of color. And you can also see here that among youth of color, Madison is no longer the lowest. So if you wanted to look where is Madison, you can just type in Madison here to compare. But I'm going to move on in the interest of time so that we have enough time if there are questions. To the last one of our equity indicators today, which is our neighborhood poverty. Neighborhood poverty is defined as the share of the population that's living in high poverty neighborhoods. And high poverty neighborhoods are census tracts with a poverty rate that's greater than 40%. So the first breakdown I can see is just years, 2012 and 2000. And we see that people of color are significantly more likely than whites to live in high poverty neighborhoods. And this is true even if they are not poor themselves. And if we look back to 2000, you can see that poverty, neighborhood poverty has actually increased a lot. So it was 12.5% in 2000, and by 2014 it had doubled to 26%. And we can also compare rates of neighborhood poverty in the city of Milwaukee to the region. So if I type in the compare, I can compare the city to the region. The region will show up in pink, and the city is in gray. And we can see that neighborhood poverty is significantly higher in the city. Only 2% of whites in the region living in high poverty neighborhoods compared with 10% of whites in the city, suggesting that white poverty is more concentrated in the city. In contrast, when we look at the Black population, the disparities in the city and the region are not as high, indicating that neighborhood poverty is a problem throughout the entire region for African Americans, not just within the city. So these equity indicators highlight barriers that growing communities of color across the country face. Now we're going to shift into one of our economic benefits indicators, which is the GDP gains with racial equity. So we already looked at this for the broader state of Wisconsin and for the U.S. as a whole, but we can also look at it as at the regional level. So here you'll notice that because I'm at the city of Milwaukee, this data is not available at this geography, and that's because economies are more regional than they are city. So it's kind of rare for someone to work and live and shop all within the same city boundaries. So we usually look at economic indicators at the regional level. So if I go to the Milwaukee region, I can see that the Milwaukee region would have been almost $13 billion larger in 2012 if there were not racial gaps in income. I'm going to briefly show you the income gains with racial equity, which is our second economic benefits indicator. And it provides a little bit more detail about average incomes for each race and ethnic group under current conditions. And this is that. And then what they could be with racial equity. So we could see huge gains for Black and Latino, Native Americans, people of mixed and other races under conditions of racial equity. So I would encourage you all to look at this indicator and see the percentage increase as well as where do these gains come from, whether that's from increases in employment or increases in wages. So I'm just going to briefly, before we go to the Q&A, show you a couple other areas of the Atlas website that are important to know. If you click on the About the Atlas section, here's where you can find a little bit more background on the tool, how it was created, our partnership, our team. If you go to the Data and Methods section, here's where you can find information about our database, the framework that Sarah went through during the slides. We have a list of frequently asked questions that I would really encourage folks to look through if you do have questions, or you can also ask us questions here today. Our technical documentation, as well as the list of the 100 largest cities and the 150 largest metro regions that are in the Atlas. And you can also see which counties are included in which regions. And the last two things I want to show you are the reports. So Sarah mentioned that we've done about a dozen equity profiles. So you can find those in reports under equity profiles. You can view those reports, and you can also see some of the different analyses that we've done over the last couple of years on full employment, on racial inclusion, and our data in action section, which is probably our most consistently updated section. This is where we have a new series that we just started called Chart of the Week, where each week we post something that's relevant to something that's happening in the national news, pulling charts from the National Equity Atlas. We also include different webinars that we've done, analyses of data, new data releases that we have, and as well as our monthly updates to keep everyone in the loop of what our team is up to. In closing, the National Equity Atlas is a living resource, and it will continue to grow and evolve to meet the needs of local leaders working to solve the nation's challenges. And we want to ensure that the data in the Atlas is current, so we are in the process of updating all of the data in the Atlas to the most recent data, which is 2014. So I encourage you to spend some time on the site, share it with your networks, let us know if you have any questions, and please share with us how you're using the data. We're always interested to hear about how communities are using the data to advance equitable policies. So thank you so much, and I'll turn it back to folks at FCI, and we can open it up for questions if there are.
Great. Thanks so much, Angel. You know, it was a really thorough tour of the National Equity Atlas, and again, it just never ceases to amaze me how user-friendly and powerful this tool can be. In particular for us, the additional breakdowns of the nativity and the ancestry is certainly important in our area, where, for example, you know, breaking out the Hmong from the overall Asian category or Asian population is tremendously useful. So I want to thank you for that, and thank you for your tour, and wanted to just ask maybe one or two questions about the National Equity Atlas, and then we did receive some questions, Sarah, maybe taking us back to the beginning of the conversation more around larger policy issues. So if I could just ask maybe Angel, just a question about, you know, you showed a lot of examples of urban areas, and you know, the majority of the state of Wisconsin is rural, and so just wondering to what degree the National Equity Atlas is able to sort of capture that.
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, the only data that we have 301 geographies in the atlas, and that is the largest 100 cities in the large 150 metro regions. So that's really just Milwaukee and Madison in Wisconsin. But I mentioned briefly earlier that we're going to be next week actually unveiling the beta version of a new mapping function that we're adding, which will allow users to be able to see both county level data as well as tract level data across the entire state. And we think this will be a really great value add for those folks who are interested in seeing data in more rural areas. It's unlikely that we will be able to add additional geographies to the atlas beyond the 301 because we have to find data sources that are available across the geographies and that are consistent. But I think that the mapping function will be a great addition to folks who are interested in seeing how some of the different indicators, how their regions are doing in some of the different indicators, even if they're not in one of those largest 100 cities or 150 metro regions. The first two maps that we're going to be unveiling are for the people of color indicator and the unemployment indicator, but we're hoping to add a few more over the next couple months.
Great. We have maybe another question or two on the National Equity Atlas. There was a question as to whether there is a metro area where there are not inequities that you've been able to identify.
Yes. No. No, there is not, but there are differences, as you saw with the ranking chart that Angel showed for the disconnected youth indicator. Some regions are doing better and worse on their share of disconnected youth, and the differences by race in who is disconnected. But every region needs to do better to close those gaps. And you know, I think that we are very much in favor of the approach to understand your gap wherever it is at, and understand where you're at in relation to other regions, and set, you know, aspirational goals and benchmarks for improving
Right.
on each indicator.
And I think the last data-related question that we got was whether there is the ability to superimpose sort of the voter turnout data on your data set to kind of get a sense of the, you know, the relationship between, or the correlation rather, between voter turnout and inequity.
We would love to add that indicator to the atlas. That would require going to each state and getting, and for each state you can get the voter file, but it would cost thousands of dollars to get it across the country, and it would be a massive project of getting the data in shape. So, you know, we are able to work with you on specific requests like that if you have them. So if somebody is really interested in doing that overlay, that would be a research project. We could, you know, talk to you about how we might be able to do that and to get that data and do the overlay. We are not planning on including or adding a sort of add your own data function. There are tools that do that, and we would recommend you to them, like Policy Map is a great tool that allows you to upload your own data. It is a resource that you need to pay for. It's a subscription resource, but that might be the best data tool for that particular project.
Great, thank you. And now kind of moving towards the more policy level type questions. One of the questions that we received was, what are the underlying conditions needed to implement policies that are aimed at getting to inclusive growth?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it depends a little bit on who's doing the asking. So if you are in a if you're working within a government agency, right, it's looking at is there buy-in from, or are an elected official but working inside government, is there buy-in for these types of policy strategies for developing the place-based approaches that are needed? If you're working outside of government, it is really about, are there people that you can work with in coalition or collaboratively to push for these strategies? So I think it's about building that broad coalition that is also in touch with and inclusive of groups that are representative of the people who are being left behind the most. So I think that meaningful community engagement and authentic participation by those communities we see as really important to moving forward those equity strategies. But I think that, yeah, broad coalition and buy-in from political leaders.
All right. The other question that we received is really, you're talking here about huge systems change in order to realize this, the idea of equitable economic growth. And could you give an example of sustained implementation of equity-related policies that really made a difference in terms of broad social conditions for people of color?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Portland example that I shared in my slides, I think that is there. It's a good example of striving for those population level changes. I think that's what everybody wants to see. They want to see actual population level changes in terms of these indicators, right, where we actually start to see those racial gaps in income close. I don't think that we've seen change on that level that can be attributable to coalitions moving things forward yet, but you see movement on things when you break it down into more specific strategies like inclusive entrepreneurship. And so I think we see a lot of good efforts that are making some progress, and a lot more is needed to really get to those population level changes.
And the more comprehensive the strategy is, kind of touching in different components of one indicator like poverty or something, the better too, rather than just kind of one-off strategies. Right. Tend to be more effective at population level results.
Mm-hmm. But this is a long haul effort. It's taken us generations to get here. It's going to take a while to get out of it. That's why really bold strategies are needed. It's great to hear about an investor. Capital is really important too. How do you get more capital to those promising strategies and approaches, and the infrastructure for moving them forward?
Yeah. And I might have asked this question at the beginning, but it's probably the last question we can take right now. And one of our listeners, just mentioned that they thought this was really good information, but where do we start?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it really depends on what is your role in the ecosystem. And where can you start to effect change? So, and also looking at your specifics. So, in terms of the data and taking a data-focused approach, it's what is your demographic change story? What is happening locally? What already exists? How are you doing on these different equity indicators? And then thinking about where change needs to happen and what you're able to move forward. What are the low-hanging fruit? What are the things that you can accomplish in the short term? And then what are the longer haul change items that you need partners to move forward?
And I think a related part of this question is, as nonprofits, what could we do? So I know a lot of folks are thinking about that issue, and we're running out of time here. But I really just want to thank both Sarah and Angel. Thank you so much for sharing this important work. And we also are very much looking forward to the data and the other breakdowns and the new cuts of the data as you make it available through the National Equity Atlas. I know that you hold a number of webinars throughout the year to share the new data sets, and I really encourage everyone that's listening to participate. So as with all of our webinars, the recording is going to be made available for playback from our website. You can also find links to last year's webinars on our website, www.forwardci.org. So one final note, when you close your browser from this session, you'll be directed to a very concise questionnaire. We want to evaluate today's webinar, and we'd appreciate it if you can take a few minutes to help us with that. Thanks again to BMO Harris for making this exciting learning opportunity available, and be well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.